It's summer vacation for the House since members left Capitol Hill last week. And ahead of their own vacation, members of the Senate have been hanging around Washington a few more days, taking care of unfinished business. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell making a mission of getting Trump nominees for judgeships confirmed. This is, of course, McConnell, who stonewalled Obama's judicial nominees, but he has been running these picks through the Senate as fast as possible. He just paved the way for 19 more with lifetime seats on the federal bench. The deal is pending approval by the Republican Senate. Now, at this point in his presidency, Obama had named 91 judges to the bench. Ahead of today's Senate session, Trump has put in 135 judges. That includes the 2 Supreme Court picks. One of the reasons he was able to fill these vacancies is because McConnell had slow-walked Obama's nominations, which means they weren't confirmed, which left extra vacancies. Now, this veritable army of Trump judges will be shaping law and policy, potentially for generations. It's all about life expectancy in many cases. Now, there's no predicting how any given judge will rule in a case, but there are ways that Trump-appointed judges are making their mark. Take a look at 2 different federal courts ruling on a new rule from the president that makes it more difficult to get asylum. Immigrant rights groups immediately went to court and tried to reverse the policy. Now, their lawsuits landed in 2 different courts. One judge said it was illegal for the president to crack down this way. The other, on the same day, said nope, the Trump administration has a fine interpretation of the law. Now, the second judge, with this potentially more conservative ruling, depending on how you look at it, was, of course, put on that court by Trump himself. Now, there's no one-to-one between a single case or a single ruling and the president who put someone on the bench. But there is an accumulation here. Legal scholars, really across the spectrum, noting that the politics of the Republican majority in the Senate, including some of its obstruction, are doing more to reshape this court system than we might have seen in the past back and forth. Mitch McConnell has the approval process for Trump judicial nominees in high gear right now. In fact, as of this evening, the Senate approving 9 new federal judges. Another slate of the president's picks slated for confirmation tomorrow. There's a lot going on, but this is major news with lifetime consequences, and we have some experts to break it down. Kenji Yoshino, constitutional law professor from the New York University School of Law, and Christine Lucius, former staff director for the Senate Judiciary Committee, now executive vice president at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Nice to see both of you.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
Christine, how does this work, and is it different than the normal push and pull between parties when they control the Senate?
This is absolutely different. What Mitch McConnell is trying to do this week is confirm more judges in a week than he allowed President Obama to have confirmed in his final 2 years in office. Mitch McConnell has been trying for the past 2 years to rush and jam as many Trump nominees through as possible because it's advancing the agenda that Mitch McConnell wants to see on the courts, which is to protect the wealthy and the powerful over the rights of the rest of us. Your opening lays out, a tale of 2 judges. And it is absolutely true. You can't guarantee with certainty how different judges will rule necessarily based on who appointed them. But what we saw in the Senate Judiciary Committee earlier this month was Ted Cruz's line of questioning of a Trump nominee that really revealed what they are looking for in judges. They are looking for activists to bring an agenda to the court. It was a revealing moment where they were no longer talking about balls and strikes. They were talking about what had this judge done to advance the cause? Had he volunteered for Republican causes? Had he done different things? And the nominee responded, well, I've been a judge, and that wasn't good enough. So it really revealed in plain sight for the first time what we've known for the past 2 years, that Trump is trying to remake the courts in order to protect the wealthy and powerful, not to be neutral.
But Kenji, there is a counter-argument to all this. And it's not a defense in any way of the judges and the nominees, but rather the observation that when it comes to the Senate, we're not really talking much about law. We're talking about politics. And Mitch McConnell has been good at hardball politics. At what point do the esteemed folks like yourself, who are, floating above politics, at least in a lot of your scholarship, say, okay, well, this really kicks back to the Democratic Party and the kind of hardball they want to play, not necessarily anything that is uniquely judicial?
Well, I guess I would say that there are laws that govern these procedures as well, and many of those rules, in the Senate have themselves been relaxed by Mitch McConnell in a form of gamesmanship where he's denied, for example, the capacity of senators to say, these are the judges whom we would recommend for our own jurisdiction. So I would float that.
You're talking about like blue slips?
Exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's not a defense of who gets on the court, but blue slips were themselves just a made-up thing for the Senate. In other words, there's no credible allegation that Mitch McConnell's committed a crime here. Right?
No.
It's not like that. It's more that you got a guy who plays hardball. During the Obama era, you had some Democrats saying, well, reach across and try to work it out and all this. And now we're talking about this in the backdrop of a Democratic Party where there's a lot more folks who are saying, yeah, you got to be just as tough as Mitch McConnell. Look at what he's getting away with.
Yeah, I think that, what I was trying to say was not that Mitch McConnell was engaged in anything that was legally improper, but rather that if you take the spirit of what a federal judge is, I think that that is an ideal that we as a nation hold very dear. The founders under Article 3 gave federal judges life tenure during good behavior, which effectively means life tenure, because, leading to the aphorism, if you're Article 3, you're free, because they wanted them to have
classic aphorism. Everyone loves that one.
Because they wanted to have the judges to have judicial independence. Why would you give somebody life tenure if you didn't want them to be objective, if you didn't want them to be a creature of a particular political party?
So how do you fix this if you see it as a problem to fix?
Well, I do see it as a problem to fix, and I think it's really troubling. I think the first thing that we can do, so there are two ways to respond to this, right? One is to say, okay, we're going to focus on elections, we're going to focus on the Senate, we're going to focus on the next president, right? And progressives are going to have a kind of Empire Strikes Back kind of moment, and that will devolve to a kind of race to the bottom. It may be that in our polarized political system that's the best that we can hope for right now.
Well, your buddy Jack Balkin, professor.
Yep.
He talks about constitutional hardball, that the reason why the Mitch McConnells of the world, and arguably Donald Trump, although he may be less informed about the tactics, are so dangerous is that you call it a race to the bottom, that you either turn the other proverbial cheek or you get into constitutional hardball where you're really straining what the Constitution thought these parts of government would do by sort of some comity or tradition. What do you do?
Right. Can I just ask us to take a step back, though? Because before we even talk about the decision tree and whether or not we're going to play hardball or whether or not we're going to turn the other cheek, we have to be sort of aware of what is going on. And so I feel like the American people at the very basic level have not been sufficiently sort of informed about the quiet revolution that's
occurring. That's a great point. I think you could argue, as I mentioned, I alluded to earlier, with everything going on, you could argue many people might be surprised to see, Christine, the statistic we referred to earlier, that there's far more Trump judges incoming than there were at this point in the Obama era. And that might even cut against people's general perception that somehow he's bad at government, or he certainly doesn't have a lot of permanent cabinet members. There's a ton of acting members there. There's other vacancies. This seems to be an area where, at least with McConnell's bidding, they're highly effective.
They are highly effective, but what I hope, and to add to Kenji's point, is that more people grow to understand. I think the healthcare case, the current case threatening the Affordable Care Act's coverage, millions of people rely on the healthcare coverage that they receive from Obamacare. That case pending right now in the Fifth Circuit is a real education moment for voters to understand the impact of the courts and what Trump is trying to do through the courts that he was not able to do through legislation. And so whether you care about health care or justice reform or voting rights or any other civil rights issue, you need to care about the courts, and you need to understand the role that the Senate plays as well as the president, because the Senate is supposed to be acting as a backstop to protect our independent and fair judiciary.
Two experts with a lot of deep knowledge on this, Kenji Yoshino from NYU and Christine Lucius from the Leadership Conference. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
When we come back, one of the biggest headlines out of this debate, next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.